Welcome to Subject to Change, a sustainability podcast. We're here with Graham Boyd, who's an expert in regenerative practice.
I just think that you're fascinating, and your work is exactly what intrigues both Lauren and I. So, thank you.
Only a pleasure, and I'm only too glad to be in this conversation. I don't know either of you very well, but Jody, I've been fascinated by your tweets and have really enjoyed and appreciated your perspective on things.
Oh,
So
thank you very much.
I'm very much looking forward to this.
Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. When you see the little microphone in the lower right, click on that to learn more. We're so glad you're here.
Lauren and I kind of undertook this adventure of Subject to Change specifically because we're fascinated with the journeys that people undergo. And we realize if we just have a conversation with people, we learn so much about our own biases, our own silos, our own power to explore, maybe.
I would say that I even learn about my fears and facing those fears, which has been educational, to say the least.
Holacracy, a new word.
I did a little bit of research on you and your work last night, and that was a word that I had never heard before. So I was excited to actually ask that question and to see if you could kind of expand on it.
Yeah, and that's the way this works, by the way. We just dive in and then we figure out what we're talking about as we go.
Perfect for me. Absolutely perfect for me.
Let's hear some context for the discussion.
One piece of background that may become relevant at some point is that I grew up in Apartheid South Africa. So I grew up in a context of a deeply dysfunctional system.
Yeah.
And a lot of what I'm doing now has come out of what I experienced growing up as a white person in Apartheid South Africa. And the other part of what feeds into what I'm doing is my first career was as a research physicist, particle physics.
Whoa.
So my background is mathematics, particle physics, and all of that kind of stuff.
That's fantastic.
So that's part of what feeds what I've been doing. And then if I jump forward, after my physics career, I joined Procter & Gamble as a manager, this small American company that very few people have ever heard of. And spent 10 years with P&G, and I left P&G in 2008, having done my best to really get things moving towards sustainability, regeneration, and everything, and ending up more and more frustrated at just how many decisions were being taken in the interests of the smooth quarterly reporting to the investor community, rather than truly addressing what was absolutely clear by the early 2000s of the climate catastrophe. And I was just shaking my head back then saying, there's so many people around me who recognize that we're in the closing stages where we can still do something to avert a climate catastrophe, but nobody's taking action. So I left P&G asking myself, as I've put it now, we've had so many failed attempts at turning the ship around. Triple bottom line, corporate social responsibility, wherever you look, at best it's slowed things down. Nothing has managed to turn the ship around. And on top of that, almost everybody I know at work is to a greater or lesser extent miserable. Work doesn't work for people.
So, I understand that. That's a good observation,
yes.
A real observation.
Thank you. And so I left and started asking myself the question, we're unable to shift the system. So somewhere there are hidden anchors anchoring this dysfunctional system in its dysfunctionality. we'd better find those anchors and pull them up. Otherwise, we'll never shift the system. And one of the first things that I came across was Holacracy. And having a physics background and an engineering background and being a computer geek, in some senses, still am a computer geek, although I have become quite socialized these days. You can you can bring me into polite company without embarrassment. So found Holacracy, and then found Sociocracy that Holacracy is derived from, and thought, oh, wow, this is brilliant. This is a way of structuring organizations where you have a requisite hierarchy, where you have a functional hierarchy, rather than an egocentric hierarchy. So Holacracy, Sociocracy, in anything larger than a few people, is not a flat organization, but it's an organization where the hierarchy is a hierarchy of functionality and a hierarchy of decision domain, not a hierarchy attached to the person. So the same person might be energizing a role that has a high level in the hierarchy. For example, she might be the legal counsel for the company. And what she says is and isn't allowed, pretty much everybody else in the company has to obey if they want to stay out of jail. So, that's a very senior position. But the same person might also be energizing a role of, I don't know, switchboard operator on Mondays, which is a very low position in the hierarchy. And so the hierarchy is attached to the functionality rather than the ego. And that opens up so much more space for a healthy organization, a workplace that works, because now you're not seduced excessively into deriving your self-identity, your self-worth, and all of those things by your title. You don't have a title. By your salary, you don't have a fixed salary necessarily. Or if you do, it might be a flat salary that's the same as everybody else. All of the aspects of today's egocentric hierarchy that create dysfunctionality are removed.
Sociocracy.
So I tried that for a while.
Fascinating.
And I found it very powerful. It's still very powerful. I tend these days to more prefer one of the flavors of sociocracy, be it Sociocracy 3.0, in that in most situations, the additional flexibility that they bring makes them a better fit to where an organization is, certainly in terms of implementation in practice. I very much believe that, like that old answer to a question of what's the best exercise for me to do to get healthy? And the answer is always something that you enjoy doing and can keep doing without pain.
That's great. And it'll change over time. In fact, that's the other aspect of it.
Yes, right? It changes over time. So, same with organization transformation. What's the best organization design? Whatever works for you now, where you are, where you need to get to at your next step, and that is not going to destroy the organization on the journey to get there. And you can change going forwards.
So that last piece is particularly fascinating, because I think there's an assumption that companies or organizations actually look at how they want to function. And I think that's what's missing most in how we do almost everything. We don't become intentional in why we're doing things a certain way. It's the same for, we're both in the design field. I'm an architect, and Lauren is an interior designer and a construction manager and runs her own business. The intentionality is something that doesn't often happen without facilitation. So that's the role you've taken on, and that's the role we've taken on with design.
Yes.
Lauren, you had more to explore in.
Well, what's really interesting,
Holacracy.
right, is so that I have the ability to run things the way that I want, right? And even I get stuck. You know, I can see the holistic side and want to get there and achieve that and to feel basically what you've said. And then even I get mired down as a one person office. I even get mired down in the hierarchy of things. It's just one person being involved in a company. So how do we intentionally start to shift even just our own perspectives? I mean, I'm in a unique position where I get to do whatever I want. And as I start to bring more people on in either consulting or, you know, part or full-time roles, I want to be structuring an organization in a way that works for me and my people. How do I start that intentionality with me, myself, and then move it to a larger group? Because that's where I'm at. I'm at this precipice right now.
Yes. Oh, that is a very powerful question. And we could easily roam through the territory of that question for a week or more.
No doubt. Yeah.
Good to know that it consuming my thoughts is appropriate then.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
My reality or yours?
Let me put two things in here. First of all, most of us in the West tend to think that reality is something out there, objective, and I just need to put in the work to grasp it, and then everything will be fine. And what I've found enormously helpful is to distinguish between my experienced reality, which is actually just inside me. It's something that I construct out of the narrow slice of everything that is, that I take in through my senses, and then it's distorted by my belief system, how I interpret the world, everything. And where that is very relevant to organizations and hierarchy and everything is to constantly ask myself how much of what I'm using to navigate by is complete fantasy that I've constructed, and how much of it is actually there.
Wow.
And I find this distinction between how much of it is actually there, how much of it is just my internal fantasy land, and there's nothing that's actually there at all, and how much of it is somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm. And then there's the complexity of every single interaction is going to be with someone else who is interpreting in their own way and finding the line between reality and their perception of reality.
Yes.
And that's where I see most people missing some awareness. They honestly think communication is all about using the right words, and if they're using the right words, then their job is done.
Yes, absolutely spot on. This is what makes working in teams so difficult. You know, if I think of, yes, and so much fun. You know, the biggest part of working together with somebody else is actually getting a better and better idea of how the other person generates their internally experienced reality. And you know, in terms of communication, what I'm saying to each of you, I'm transmitting words that have the meaning I intend out of my internally experienced reality. And the words are pointing at the concepts I have in my reality, but you're hearing the words out of your experienced reality and assuming that I'm pointing at the concept that you use the word to point at.
It's intense. It's a wonder people ever get married. I mean,
Yes.
I just have to say that out loud because
Or work in teams in general.
or work in teams.
Yes, exactly. It's an absolute miracle that we manage to do anything even with one other person, let alone with 20 or 100.
Yeah.
It's absolutely amazing.
And I'm at the other end of the spectrum from when Lauren, I just joined a firm that has almost 500 people. And so it's quite a different experience, but with the same building blocks.
Yes. Yes, very much the same building blocks.
You unknowable you.
Now, I'll bring in something else as well. One of my central then ways of looking at the world coming out of that is to recognize that a significant part of me is unknowable.
Mm.
I may be able to know who I am now 5 or 10 years in the future, but it's opaque to me here. It's unknowable. And the same with organizations. An organization has a very large unknowable component. And this is one of the pitfalls when it comes to organization design, organization practices, especially when an external consultant comes in and tells you what your organization should look like, is that the unknowable, at best, you can have an intuition that the unknowable has somewhat this characteristic, but you have built up that intuition over years of working in that company, where you develop a feel for what cannot be articulated, cannot be pinned down, at least not at that point in time. Maybe in 5 years' time, it will become knowable. But by that point, the unknowable part will have grown and changed because of everything you've been doing. So, it will always be unknowable.
Business parenting.
I think there's like all this fascination going through my head, tied to regenerative practice and understanding that it's kind of, I liken it to being a parent. You're trying to create the security and the safety and the confidence so that the child you're raising can raise themselves and evolve as they need to be a human, right? To be a complete human. But we don't apply that same emotional intelligence to business, and we really need to. So it's the evolving system.
Is it hopeless?
And then the other piece that occurs to me when you were talking about an outside facilitator coming in is we often look for someone to hand us the answers, but none of this can be handed to anyone. That's part one. And part two is you've created a business around facilitating, but process work, deep process work, isn't valued at the level it should be valued in the industry. How have you personally struggled with that, and what have you found that to help you keep going in this work? Because I'm assuming it has been a struggle. And that's a grand assumption on my part.
Yes, it's definitely been a struggle, and it still is a struggle. There are many days where I do struggle. There are many things I want to now put in response to what you've been saying. I'll put in one thing that I'd like to bring in. So there are a growing number of people who over the past 2 to 3 years have woken up to just how serious the climate catastrophe is, and who have gone from this is nothing to worry about straight through to it's hopeless, we're doomed, without passing go in between and without collecting $200 as they go around the board. And in the early 2000s, I was already starting to say to myself, is it hopeless? And one of the things that keeps me going is what I was saying a moment ago about the unknowable part. By simply recognizing that there is much that is, from where we are today, unknowable. That is at least something that keeps me going, despite all of the setbacks, is that sense of we cannot know. We cannot say for certainty that the planet for humanity is doomed. There is always some surprise that may pop up around the corner when we get to the corner, where we realize, oh, this, as Don Beck says, what is it that I don't know that I don't know, where once I know it will change everything? And
now for some, does that create an inaction? Because that's what concerns me. Oh, I probably shouldn't have asked that question so quickly, but I feel like I've encountered situations where that lack of knowledge has made people sit and wait, as opposed to saying, I will do all that is in my power in this moment, trusting that the next moment will just give me more information that I can then act on.
Yes, yes. There are definitely some people for whom that paralyzes them, not knowing. For me, that's exactly what gives me hope.
Yeah.
I don't know, and therefore, something may emerge that gives me hope.
An unlikely superpower.
One of my superpowers is depression. So I first started experiencing depression in my early teens. And it's an aspect of myself that it's never really left me. I still have depressed episodes. Now, I say it's a superpower because having spent most of my life working with a deep sense of despair that is coming from inside me and still keeping going, I'm far better practiced at staying in action in the middle of a felt sense of despair than most other people are. Wow. So in a sense, for me, the despair that comes from our current climate situation is just an additional source for despair. It's not a complete change in my internal situation.
That's actually, I love that. Thank you. That perspective is incredible, because I think we have a tendency, at least in the society in the USA, to relegate people who are struggling with anything to a lesser, when in fact you've illustrated that it's an aspect of resilience and strength that we can all learn from. How incredible.
Yes.
You just reframed something that I wasn't even aware needed reframing in my head. Thank you again.
Yeah.
Only a pleasure.
Optimism in uncertainty.
Well, in multiple things. So, I mean, there was that. I love this idea of, using uncertainty too as a reason to be optimistic. And it's so funny that, you tied this conversation, funny, not funny, but it's interesting to me because not 10 minutes ago, I was watching you speak and be so animated and this huge smile, and you're truly passionate. I was like, oh my God, I don't think that there's a happier man in the whole world. And so, but to me, it kind of makes sense. It almost makes it make more sense that you could have these bouts of depression and be facing some of the same challenges, but you have this resiliency and therefore this kind of optimism, I think, that continues.
And
how
cultivated.
Do you practice that? Do you practice that?
I do definitely practice that. One of some of the patterns that we've developed in what we call our adaptive way, which is, let's say it's a language for dialogue in organizations and within oneself, so that the tensions, the stresses that emerge in work become part of one's developmental journey.
Rising Phoenix.
And one of the patterns which I find very helpful, we call it Rising Phoenix, which is whenever something has happened that I'm judging as bad, is to ask myself, what good can I imagine might emerge out of this bad thing? And then the advanced version, if I can't imagine anything good coming out of it, is to then say to myself, and do I at least accept that my imagination is limited versus everything that can happen in the future?
Wow.
Just because I can't imagine something good coming out of it doesn't mean nothing good can come out of it.
That requires you and requires us to actually recognize that our ego cannot dominate the moment we're in. We are part of what's going on, but not all of what's going on.
Yes.
And I think that's another thing that ties in with holacracy and facilitation and process work and practice. Lauren, you use the term practice. And we always talk about yoga being a practice and regenerative practice being a practice, because we know that it's the process and the journey that matters. And there's also no end point. It will always be a practice because time continues and our abilities change. This fascinates me. In a world that wants answers, this way of thinking is often a struggle for people to engage with.
The opposite of a truth.
It is. It's a big struggle. One of the chapters in my book is very much around developing the capacity to think in this way, because this is a way of thinking that people develop after they've fully mastered linear logic. This is a way of thinking where, for instance, you're able to recognize that the opposite of a deep truth might be another equally deep truth rather than a falsehood. And once you can recognize, I'm regularly in arguments with people, and part of what we then explore when we're in conflict is, are we both saying something that is deeply true and in opposition?
That's amazing. And I just want to make sure that we clarify this book, which I have not yet read.
Yes, I wanted to ask. Thank you, Jody. Rebuild
the Economy, Leadership, and You. And you're going to show us the book. Excellent.
Yes.
That's the book.
Wonderful.
So, Rebuild the Economy, Leadership, and You, a toolkit for builders of a better world.
I need that toolkit.
Yes, get it.
I will, definitely.
I will be getting it as well.
Please do.
Wonderful.
My co-author, Jack Reardon, he's an economics professor in the US. And between the two of us, and Jack is somebody who has been on his own personal journey. So whilst most people see him as an economics professor, there's a multifaceted human being in there. And he's just actually published a novel, Swimming Backwards, over there, which is a novel about identity, gender identity, and all of that sphere of things, which is not the standard book that you expect an economics professor to publish.
I think that's marvelous. Really, like, I always wonder what people do when they're not doing what I think that they're supposed to be doing. It's like, my assumptions set aside.
That's very much why Jack and I wrote Rebuild.
Discovery through work.
And what should economics be if it starts by assuming that a rational decision is unique to each individual at each point in time, rather than something that is objective. So we have at the one end that macro scale, and then we have, I think it's 4 chapters in the book, which is distilling everything that we've come across in terms of how can you support each individual's inner journey towards higher adult development in the workplace, so that the capacity to think beyond linear logic is something that is developed through work. The capacity to recognize processes in the world that span decades rather than just days or weeks. That all of that development happens in the workplace.
An organization is?
An organization as a whole, in many senses, is best looked at as a living being, and to a large extent is unknowable. And as you were saying a little bit earlier, we really ought to get away from looking at organizations, companies as things, as property, and really start to look at them as living beings, where our role is far more the role of a parent, caring for the living being unfolding, at least in the sense of in loco parentis, speaking on behalf of a living being that structurally does not have the ability to communicate on its own behalf. And so we need to do the communication on its behalf.
And that role can be taken by any person in any organization. And that does something that I think is missing from the work sphere currently, broadly missing from the work sphere, is the people, like somebody who's at the low end of the current structure feels less connected and less that they have less agency in where the company is going and how it's performing and what it's doing. They feel like a cog in the wheel. But if you treat, and this is part of, I think, functioning on function rather than title, if you get that spirit of connection and that parenting mindset, talk about tapping into people's will to work toward a better future. You've just opened that door in a way that it's usually not open.
Yes, exactly.
That's amazing.
May I build on that?
Yes, please. Fascinated. Graham, this is amazing.
What's a company for?
Recall that I mentioned South Africa. Now, about 10, 12 years ago, I started asking myself, what's a company for? What's a company really for? And there's a brilliant book by Charles Handy with exactly that title, which gave me a lot of food for thought. So the first interesting thing, I love playing with words. The word company comes from 2 Latin words, com panis, with bread. The original company was a group of Romans that bonded together to share food with each other, to share resources, because by sharing, collaborating, they could thrive better than alone. So in many senses, the original company is somewhat what we would today call an intentional community.
Very nice. You just absolutely sparked Lauren in a way that I could see that happen.
Excellent. So if we now start to think of a company as an intentional community that just happens to have as part of its intention today, working together to create some kind of value for some part of society, rather than just for the members of the company, that then changes a lot.
Static and dynamic.
Did I understand correctly, Lauren? Your work is in architecture.
Interior design.
Interior design.
Yes,
right.
Close enough.
Okay, so let's stay with interior design. It's all well and good to have a magnificent design, but at some point you actually need to build the design.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about design, it's also about building. And then if you think of interior design is as much about static elements, systems, as it is about dynamic elements, interactions, movement, flow.
Mm-hmm.
And the two are distinct, but inseparable. Two of the stories that came in, and I go into detail on how we're building companies now in our startup creation program, where we build ecosystems of regenerative startups our way. And the two things I realized, the first thing I realized was, if we think of a company as an intentional community, when we buy or sell a company, what we're actually buying or selling are all of the human beings associated with the company and their relationships with each other. We are applying concepts of property to a person. Legally, a company is a person just as much as you or I are. Mm-hmm. And the accepted definition of slavery is the application of any or all of the concepts of property to a person. So no wonder we have degenerative, extractive, horrible places to work companies out there, because in a slightly abstract sense, we're treating the company as property, which means we end up treating the individuals inside as property, and that removes agency. You don't have agency if you are in any sense whatsoever being treated as property.
Uncomfortable, but good.
If the company itself is treated as property, then of course the people within it are part of that definition, and that's going to cause me to struggle for a while.
Yes.
In a very positive way. I think that's really good.
Yes.
Uncomfortable but good.
Excellent. I love that. Uncomfortable but good is a very good place to be.
The past is not prologue. Don't tell Shakespeare.
Maybe even everything that has led to success in the past will lead to failure in the future.
Yeah.
And in that sense, to my mind, there's nothing that we believe is the right way of doing things based on the past has any right to automatically have a free ticket into the future.
It's amazing, and that it is I feel that over the last 30 or 40 years we have become enamored with things like efficiency and frictionless and simplifying and what's the answer, solution based, and I'm a big fan of learning from nature, and nature is none of those things. Right?
No.
She's very messy, constantly evolving, never stays where you put her. All of these things are the lessons that I think are part of regenerative framework and will help transition business and communities as well. We've just been trained to resist them, to try and smooth them over, to try and make them clean, to try and
Healing systems.
If we stay with nature for a moment, Margaret Wheatley, who's really done a superb job of understanding nature and connecting with it, organizational life. One of her statements that has really stayed with me is, you know, if a natural ecosystem is injured, to heal itself, it reconnects itself with more of itself.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm.
yet the way that we build businesses prevents connection between businesses. It prevents businesses forming ecosystems.
Apartheid Structure.
Yeah.
And I'll go into the South African bit that I've alluded to a couple of times.
Yes, please.
In addition to my realizing, oh, wait a minute, we build companies along the same kind of patterns that we built direct slavery, only now it's indirect via a legal construct. It also struck me, oh, wait a minute, the essence of the apartheid South Africa that I grew up in, which removed agency. There was the, let's say, part of apartheid was human nature. And we're not going to change human nature anytime soon. But the other part of it was the structures and the structured interactions that prevented connectivity, for example, prevented most of the interactions and eliminated agency. And the heart of that is something really simple. In apartheid South Africa, if you were lucky enough to be born with a white skin, you got all of the voting rights, which meant you controlled where the country went and you controlled how the wealth was distributed. And the way we incorporate companies today, if you're lucky enough to have money to invest, you get all of the voting rights, you control what happens to the company, and you control how the wealth is distributed. And if it's impossible, and we have more than enough evidence that you cannot build a viable country on an apartheid design principle, nor do I believe we can build a viable regenerative economy on a design principle that separates out in how we incorporate individual companies, all of the different capitals that actually flow in and out of the company from governance power and from wealth share, and they're representing stakeholders.
It's incredible. I had when you were talking about apartheid in South Africa, I as a visual person, I pictured a line drawn, vertically. And then when you started to apply that same concept of apartheid to economics, I saw horizontal lines, a stratification of wealth.
Yes.
And both are absolutely, it's separate and unequal. I don't know why anyone thought there was such a thing as separate and equal. That never works. It never works.
No.
And that's going to bring home for me a lot of the things that I'm seeing in the United States. Of course, the economic disparity is stronger than the racial or the sexual disparities, and more so controlling that it has exacerbated the racial and the sexual disparities.
Yes.
That's a very strong point. I am challenged this morning in a way.
I am going to watch this over and over and over. Like at least once a week. I'm going to have this thing memorized in like a month.
It's incredible because I keep focusing on words. Graham, you use, we've talked about intentional community, intentional businesses. And then I, in processing how I see that word, I have this little caution flag go up, because a lot of people think intentional means designed and finished and done and set aside. I did that intentionally. It's done.
Yes.
So there's the other piece of language and experience that's cultural, is the whole been there, done that, finished, what's next. So I need to make sure that I'm not processing these comments and this discussion and thinking I'm done processing this discussion. I think the processing as Lauren pointed out, needs to go on. And
Yes.
boy, is my job going to be a whole new realm.
Today, new knowledge.
I'm curious. I'm curious, Jody. It's like I want to do this conversation again.
Yeah.
And hear how you start to apply this differently, given the restructuring taking place.
Yeah.
At work. And even for myself to even think about how I'm going to start to make a change with self first, and then by adding to this team.
This conversation is changing my relationship to how we're organized, which we'll see what happens. I'm a big fan of the holding these thoughts up to what I'm experiencing during the day and seeing what I learned from that reflection. And I don't know where anything's going to go right now, but this is information I didn't have yesterday.
Yes. Yeah. And isn't that a delightful place to be? If you think back to where you were yesterday and the worries that you had yesterday, or the hopes that you had yesterday, and the plans you were making yesterday for perhaps next week or next month or next year, and now perhaps it's time to go back to everything that you were doing yesterday. And because it's changed completely, because you now have something that you didn't know yesterday.
Exactly. And some of the information has been clarifying of thoughts I already had, but some of the introduction of thoughts is truly new. And that I embrace going forward. Yesterday was my birthday, so
happy birthday for yesterday.
So I'm considering this interview, this chat, my birthday gift. It's been really good.
Whet our appetite.
Me too.
And
oh my gosh, great.
I just want to show you one thing to whet your appetite for the next conversation.
Okay, good.
If
and then we have 2 quick questions for you before we leave.
So this graph shows 100 companies built the way we normally build them. And it looks much like a typical investor's portfolio. Most of the companies go bankrupt, and the average returns are dominated by 1 or 2 unicorns. If I change one thing, which is instead of the companies being disconnected companies the way we build them today, I build in a systemic connection the way nature builds it.
Yeah.
None of them goes bankrupt. The average returns are 10 times higher, and even the middle company is doing better than the average in the previous slide. So this I can dive into. This is one of the things that really gives me hope that we actually can build a regenerative economy with just a few small changes by learning from how nature works.
This is what local is, because as soon as you do locally based companies, they are inherently interconnected in a way that you don't see.
Yes.
In the broader world.
Relief in the uncertain.
I love that this conversation has brought me back to multiple of our other interviews, thinking about Majora Carter and her most recent book, rebuilding the communities of, we'll call them low status communities, to use her wording. And then even the 2041 project, thinking about things that we can't imagine, we're reframing and then working towards a different idea. These are things that I think are starting to kind of reoccur in our conversations, and, from all different pockets and different places across, at this point, the world, these conversations. And I find it so amazing. And I'm so appreciative, because I do a little bit of horoscope sort of work. And with this most recent Mercury in retrograde, we're supposed to be dealing with our shadow selves, and our shadow self is to focus on, for me as a Libra, with my rising star being a Taurus, I'm supposed to focus on fear. I'm supposed to kind of become comfortable with my fear. And I have to say that I think that this conversation has really taken me there, and to find relief in the uncertain.
Graham's heroes.
Let's say I have I probably don't have anybody now that I would call a hero, because everyone I look at is deeply flawed. And each of them, you know, the stronger the admirable part of them, the more deeply flawed the flawed part of them often is.
Ooh.
But you know, clearly coming from South Africa, two of the people that I take inspiration from is Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. And
How wonderful.
Perhaps, if I have to pick one, it's possibly even more Desmond Tutu than Nelson Mandela. His ability to retain a sense of joy and fun, despite everything that he was doing and experiencing.
Yeah, actually, one of the very early U.S. Green Building conferences I went to had Desmond Tutu as the keynote, and I knew very little about him. And he got up on stage, and I could feel halfway through a crowd of 8,000 people, I could feel the love and the joy and the excitement about whatever was to come, and it was seriously palpable. Amazing.
Yes,
I appreciate both. Thank you. Nice reminder.
Yes.
And a focus for us all to seek to apply.
And our other question that we ask is, if we could make everyone in the world stop what they were doing right now and focus on one collective initiative, what would your initiative be?
my initiative would be to engage with to engage in the middle of where power is dysfunctional and cannot flow, which is to reincorporate every company in a way that all of the capitals and all of the people involved in that company in any role whatsoever have an appropriate level of power to vote and engage with the company as parents rather than in a possessive sense. That would be my one thing. And obviously I then like them to put all of their time, energy, effort, and money into such companies which will be inherently regenerative, because all of the capitals are represented in the company in power as well as in practice.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Oh,
what a good, well, it's morning here. What a good morning. This is like an exciting morning for me.
And a wrap up. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much for your generosity and your communication. Your open, calm communication has given me time to mentally explore some of the things that were new to me. And I think not very many people communicate in that way. And I very much appreciate that.
Thank you. And I very much appreciate that feedback. It's impossible to really know the value that other people are receiving from what I'm saying and doing. So I very much appreciate that feedback. And equally from my side, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I found it an absolute delight to be asked the questions that the two of you have been asking me, which, from what I'm seeing, coming from a genuine love of humanity and the planet, and a care and a desire and a belief that there's still something that we can do.
Oh, yeah. I believe that down to my toes.
Mhm.
Some days my toes are not as happy as other days, but I always believe it down to my toes.
Perfect.
Excellent.
Thank you
And we
so
will be
much.
getting your book.
Yes,
That's awesome.
Beautiful.
And probably swimming backwards, because that sounds fascinating as well.
it does. Yeah.
Okay.
All
It
right.
is. It's a fascinating book. I've loved it. Thank you, the two of you. This has been an absolute delight, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Yes,
Thank you so
definitely need a
much,
next
Graham.
conversation.
Have a
Beautiful.
great
Thank
rest of
you.
your day.